Thanks to everyone for joining us. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual and live events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on our social media channels via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Daniel James Brown talking about his new book, Facing the Mountain, in conversation with Tom Ikeda. Daniel James Brown is the author of The Indifferent Stars Above, Under a Flaming Sky, and The Boys in the Boat, a New York Times bestselling book that was awarded the ALA's Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. His newest work, Facing the Mountain, is a gripping World War II saga of patriotism and courage that tells the story of the special Japanese-American unit that overcame brutal odds in Europe, their families incarcerated back home, and a young man who refused to surrender his constitutional rights, even if it meant imprisonment. Facing the Mountain is an unforgettable chronicle of wartime America and the battlefields of Europe. Based on Brown's extensive interviews with families of the protagonists, as well as deep archival research, it portrays the kaleidoscopic journey of 4 Japanese-American families and their sons who volunteered for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and were deployed to France, Germany, and Italy. Whether fighting on battlefields or in courtrooms, these were Americans under unprecedented strain, doing what Americans do best: striving, resisting, pushing back, rising up, standing on principle, laying down their lives, and enduring. Brown will be joined in conversation tonight by Tom Ikeda, who's the former executive director of Densho, a Seattle-based nonprofit dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing Japanese-American history and promoting social justice and equity. And he's also the author of Facing the Mountain's Foreword. So this event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, support Daniel and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his book from us. A link to buy Facing the Mountain will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight. All right, Daniel and Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. So Dan, I'll start out. I mean, I'll play the role of moderator. I'll be asking you questions. But before we start, I'm just glad you're here. I mean, we have this kind of horrendous windstorm up here, and I noticed you're in a different location and you had to move, right?
Yeah, so I lost power at our house, and about a half an hour ago, I thought I was going to have to do this holding a cell phone in front of my face. And fortunately, some friends who live not too far away still have power. So I dashed over here and sitting in their study, and I'm ready to go.
Oh, good. So, I thought what we do today is, talk about a little bit about how we met and then the book, but I also want to spend some time talking about how, you're writing, Facing the Mountain, how it rhymes with some of the things happening today. So that's kind of what we'll be focusing on. And again, to reiterate what Nick said, I'm really hoping that people have questions. And so please use the Q&A and I'll be monitoring that and asking questions as we go. But Dan, I thought what would be interesting is to talk a little bit about first how the two of us met. I looked at the calendar, and it's been now 7 years, and we first met in Seattle. It was at the Seattle Center, and we were both there to accept awards from the Mayor's Arts Awards, and I was there to accept the award for Densho, which, as Nick was saying, we've been collecting the stories of Japanese Americans now for 26 years. We're known pretty widely now across the country as the story keepers of the Japanese American story, especially during World War II. Over 1,000 of these stories that we have. And I was there, 7 years ago, accepting an award for Densho because of this. But I was equally excited because I was going to meet you, because I was a big fan of The Boys in the Boat. I had read that. I'm a University of Washington graduate and a big sports fan. So, the crew story was something that I had known. And what struck me was, how you took this story that I thought was kind of almost like a local sports story but the way you wrote it made it so popular, much more broadly. And so I was really excited because in a similar way, I have been so focused on the Japanese American story around World War II and wanted to meet you and talk to you about that story. And when we first met, you actually said you were interested in the story. Tell me why you were interested and how you went from there.
Yeah, well, for one thing, just standing on that stage with you and listening to you talk about what you do at Densho, the 26 years you've spent collecting all these oral histories. That in itself fascinated me because I'm always looking for troves of stories like that. I've always been interested in Japanese American history for a number of reasons having to do with my upbringing. And I gathered from what you were saying that a lot of the stories you had collected were about the World War II generation. And as in The Boys in the Boat, I've always been particularly interested in certain kinds of stories, stories of resilience and perseverance and people coming together under difficult circumstances and overcoming great odds. And especially as those played out in that generation of Americans that I talk about in The Boys in the Boat. So the things you were saying really, resonated with me. And I remember that I went home that evening and got online and got on the Densho website and clicked in and started listening to and watching some of these oral histories you've collected. And, so many of them were so mesmerizing. These were deeply personal stories about people doing extraordinary things, and many of them really touched me even that first night when I was just first dipping into them. So right away I thought this had a lot of potential, and so as you know, I reached out to you, and then over subsequent weeks and months and years you and I started going back and forth about some of these stories, and you helped me a great deal in sort of zooming in on some of those stories that I might be able to weave together into a coherent narrative. So that's really how it got going.
Yeah, and from my perspective, actually in those first few weeks, you differentiate yourself from about 90% of the other people that first kind of contact Densho, because I've been doing this now for 26 years, and because we have this in some ways treasure trove of stories, you can imagine I've been in contact with hundreds of authors, filmmakers, curriculum developers who really want to do something with these stories, but frankly 90% of them don't follow through. And so it's been such an interesting experience working with you, because not only were you interested, and as you say, you dived into the resources, but you did so much additional more research. I mean, you went to other archives, you were pretty soon, and I think you appreciate this. I mean, we would just be able to sit down and really talk kind of like historian to historian about, the different perspectives. And I think what you brought, because I was so focused on this one topic really on Japanese American history, World War II, you brought this different perspective in terms of seeing the stories more as an American story versus just a Japanese American story. So I really love that dialogue we had back and forth.
Yeah. I mean, it was very fruitful for me, certainly. I try to write. I didn't, as I delved into this, I didn't want to try to write a comprehensive history of the Japanese American experience. That just isn't, well, I'm not Japanese American. I think that would be inappropriate. And it's also just really not what I do. What I do is I try to find deeply personal stories that shed some light on a slice of history, and use whatever skills I have as a storyteller to bring those stories together and weave them together and present them to an audience. So it was really through working with you, and I was able very slowly to find the four principal figures that I thought we should focus on.
But at times, I'm not sure how helpful I was, because I know there was this sort of back and forth where when you first said you want to do this, I said, well, it's a very big story. And I remember you coming, he says, is there one person you could focus, or one family? You
Yeah.
said, you brought it from one person to one family. And I said, no, I mean, they're just, it's so much bigger. And I think I kept pushing other stories. Well, okay, Dan, here are 12, maybe you
Yeah.
could do it with 12. And,
Right.
and I think was the back and forth was really interesting and valuable to me, because finally you did, you narrowed it down to 4, but you first had to narrow down in terms of the themes and topics that you
Right.
want to look at.
So yeah, and in doing that, I necessarily cut a certain amount of, even within the more limited confines of the Japanese and American experience during World War II, there were still things that I was not going to be weaving into this tale, just because I had the need to focus it on these 4 individuals. So by definition, there were certain things I wasn't going to be covering. But what I decided to focus on finally was I wanted to talk about young men of draft age, Nisei men of draft age, because it seemed to me that, obviously everybody of Japanese descent living in this country had a very difficult set of circumstances to overcome, beginning with Pearl Harbor. Well, actually beginning before Pearl Harbor, but in terms of the war, beginning with Pearl Harbor. There were so many problems thrown at Japanese Americans, but young men of draft age had a sort of particular set of dilemmas that they had to navigate, and dilemmas are always what make for interesting stories. These young men, high school students or college students or kids working on farms or in the family business, after Pearl Harbor, they watched as their friends and classmates, their buddies next door, and so on and so forth, went downtown and tried to enlist, or did enlist in the service, and went off to war. And universally, when those who wanted to went down and tried to enlist, they were told that they couldn't, that they were something called enemy aliens, even though they were in fact American citizens. At the same time, they and or their family members were being rounded up and forced into these concentration camps. So, how do you navigate that if you're an 18, 19, 20-year-old young man? There's a really difficult set of things you have to tackle, moral decisions you have to make. So I wound up focusing on 4 young men, 3 of whom did enlist in the service when they finally were allowed to, and 1 who was a resistor. And I think we're going to talk about each of those, but that became the focus.
Yeah, so let's talk about the first one. And the first person we want to highlight is Gordon Hirabayashi, who grew up in the Seattle area. And you mentioned 3 of the 4 characters joined the military, but Gordon took a different path. So talk a little bit about Gordon and why you chose him.
Gordon's such an interesting young man, and I think of these 4, he's the one that some people may have heard of before. His legal battle fought its way all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So certainly in Seattle, a lot of people know his name. Gordon was a young man of extraordinarily strong principles, and he lived his life according to those principles. He actually became a Quaker. It was everything for Gordon really depended on whether or not it could be reconciled with what he believed were the right principles for being an American and moving forward in life. So the first thing that happened with Gordon in regards to the story is that a curfew was imposed on anybody of Japanese descent in the city of Seattle, and nobody of Japanese descent could be out on the streets after 8 p.m. So Gordon took upon himself to disobey that curfew, and in fact to keep a log and keep notes of the occasions on which he was deliberately violating the curfew. And this was a decision he came to based on his principles. And I think we can actually have him talk about that in his own words here.
Yeah, so we have a clip of Gordon, and he is talking about being at the University of Washington Suzulo Library, and as Dan mentioned, there's an 8 p.m. curfew, And so Gordon every night is studying with his classmates, and every time 5 minutes to 8, he leaves. And so this is kind of an interesting kind of clip in terms of, and I did this with Gordon about 20, I think 22, 23 years ago, in terms of his thought process, which I found really interesting. So let's listen to this.
Then one day, I'm dashing home. Hey, Gordon, it's 5 to 8. I grab my stuff and it takes about 5 minutes to get home. So I was just dashing home, and it hit me. A question that I should have faced earlier, it just hit me. How come I'm dashing home and all your timekeepers are still there? It just needed the question to be raised. I knew I couldn't answer it, without saying I can't do it. I turned around and went back to the library. Hey, what's the matter? And I said, well, you guys are here. We got work to do. I said, I got work to do too. I decided if you guys are here, I'm gonna work with you. I'll go back when you guys are ready to go. Nobody turned me in. And I didn't take that until it hit me. And when it hit me, I knew, gosh, I can't do it. That's two-faced.
No, I love that clip. I mean, it's funny. I've watched that clip a lot more, but it's kind of interesting when he kind of went to the dialogue with his classmates, how he transformed himself back to that like 20-year-old and just being there. I really
And that was just the beginning for Gordon. Shortly after that, came time for everybody of Japanese descent to get on buses and be taken away to an assembly center in Puyallup, and from there be shipped off to permanent concentration camps. When the time came for people in Gordon's neighborhood to get on the bus and be taken away, Gordon just didn't do it. And so he instead of getting on the bus, he wrote a statement of principle out, addressed, I think it was to the FBI. And he took that statement and he went downtown Seattle and he walked into the FBI offices in Seattle, and he handed them this statement, in which, as I say, based on constitutional principles, he explained why he could not, in good conscience, allow himself to be taken away to one of these camps. And the FBI agents didn't know what to do with this young man. He was literally the only person in the Northwest who had refused to fill out the registration form to get put on the buses. And actually, it was the filling out of the form that Gordon wouldn't do. At one point, he told the agents, take a couple big guys, throw me in the back of a car, drive me down to Puyallup. You can do that, but I'm not going to sign the form. So the FBI spent that day taking him around to different locations in Seattle, trying to get Gordon to sign this registration form. He wouldn't do it. The end of the day, he wound up in the King County Jail in Seattle. And then that was the battle, that was the beginning of a long series of legal battles in which he was in and out of jails and work camps, and finally wound up in a federal prison.
Yeah, no, he was such a principled person. And, as such, I was thinking when you mentioned the jail and things, but it was also really hard. I mean, he talked also during the interview, the emotional impact, and you talk about that in the book. But, the thing that struck me about Gordon was how much courage it took for him to make that stand. Yeah. And so I think it's a good segue to talk about the other three men who served in the military, because they exhibit a different type of courage in terms of what they did, the decisions they made. And so the next person we're going to, kind of talk about is we're going to go all the way to Hawaii. And, Katsugo Miho, Katz Miho was his, Katz was his nickname. And I'm so glad that you included the Japanese American experience from Hawaii, because most of my research has been on the mainland, the West Coast of the United States, and the people who went to camp. the experiences of Japanese Americans in Hawaii was very different. So talk about Katz and what role he plays in this in the book.
Yeah, again, such an interesting young man. Katz's family ran a family hotel, little small hotel on Maui at a time when Maui was essentially one big sugarcane plantation. And so he grew up on Maui, but he was actually a student at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack. In fact, he witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor from the roof of his residence hall at the university. And he was also a member of the campus ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. So as the attack was unfolding, he heard over the radio that ROTC cadets were to report to the campus across the street. So he put on his ROTC uniform. He ran across the campus with hundreds of other young men, actually a large portion of them Japanese Americans. They assembled in this gymnasium and they were issued these old 1903 rifles and some cartridges. And they were told they were now part of something called the Hawaii Territorial Guard, a new military unit. So that night, Katz found himself down on the waterfront in Honolulu in a sort of industrial area in the dark, patrolling back and forth with this old gun to protect against what everybody expected would be an imminent Japanese invasion by Japanese imperial forces. And Katz was enormously proud to be in uniform and to be doing something in light of what he had seen at Pearl Harbor, to be helping his country. And he was very proud of being in the Territorial Guard. That came though to a surprising and unfortunate end. And I think we have a clip where Katz talks about how that ended.
Yeah, so let me bring this up. And so yeah, so as Dan mentioned, he's going to talk about his time with the Hawaii Territorial Guard, and this video is courtesy of the University of Hawaii. So let's play this.
Our group of University of Hawaii students were dropped off as guards over area in the dark on 4-hour shifts, and for 2-3 nights in a row we were serving as, I don't know what we would have done, because we were given a loaded rifle. We were given a loaded rifle with 5 rounds of ammunition. We didn't even know how to fire the gun. But we were given this rifle. We were told, you load it this way, this is the way how you lock it in case anything happens. And to this day, I wonder, what was if anything happened was what they were referring to, because not that nothing happened, but what if anything had happened, what were we supposed to do, because we're not giving any kind of orders. A month and a half later, early in the morning, we got called up and said, hey, we're going to report down to Lanakila Intermediate School. And we woke up at about 2 o'clock in the morning. They woke us up at 2 o'clock. And then finally, about 5:30, a truck came by to pick us up. We were all fully packed and everything. We dropped us off at Lanakila. We wondered what was going on. We found out that the whole battalion was assembled at Lanakila. And then Major Frazier, who was the acting commander of the battalion, came up and told us point blank, right straight in our face, he says, the reason why you are here this morning is because all you Americans or Japanese, I'm pretty sure he referred to it, Americans of Japanese ancestry, because of your ethnic background, you are being discharged herein right off the bat, right as of now, you are being discharged from the Hawaiian territory. Only the AJAs. And completely still shocked.
I really like that clip because it just shows how much, the personality of the men that you wrote about, and you could just see the sparkle in his eye when he talked about if anything happens, but also, kind of that, in the book, I think you really captured not only from Kat's perspective, but I think Ted Tsukiyama and others in terms of how difficult, how emotional, heart-rending it was when those, when they were, those rifles were taken away from them.
Yeah, some of the accounts, these guys are in this athletic field in the pre-dawn darkness, and some of them mentioned that as they were standing there after that order came down, they could hear other boys around them, young men around them, crying in the darkness. They were so shocked and so ashamed that they were not going to be able to serve. So Katz went back to Maui, worked on construction on Maui for the next year. And then early in 1943, the Roosevelt administration reversed course and decided to create an all-Japanese American Army unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And so at that point, Katz was one of about 10,000 Japanese American young men who rushed to the enlistment offices and tried to sign up. Not all of them were accepted, but I think the largest single contingent, the most successful recruitment across the whole country was actually amongst these Hawaiian young men. So he wound up in the U.S. Army early in 1943.
During this presentation, we're talking about, kind of four main characters who are all men, but, in your book, and my wife always reminds me to ask this question. You actually write a lot about the women also. And in particular, I think one of the characters that really stood out was Katz's sister. Talk a little bit about her and maybe, your treatment of women in the book.
Yeah, so, all these events, the war, the concentration camps, these were things that affected whole families, of course. And so their moms and girlfriends and wives and daughters are all an important part of this story, even though by definition, I focused the book on young men of draft age. Katz's sister, Fumie, was very interesting. She grew up on Maui, like Katz, but she got so tired of the racial stratification of the plantation system in Hawaii that she decided she was fed up with that. She wanted to try her life in Japan. So she moved to Japan before the war started, not long before the war started, and was there when the attack on Pearl Harbor began. And so in the book, we see glimpses of her life from time to time in Japan as things went seriously bad, actually, for Japanese people as the war went on, of course. And she wound up, she and her sister-in-law, and brother-in-law, I should say, wound up moving to a village just outside of Hiroshima late in the war. And she had a job actually in downtown Hiroshima. So the morning of the atomic bombing of that city, she missed her train. She was late, and so she missed her train, and she was on the platform waiting for the next train when the bomb fell. So she witnessed, from some distance, but still quite close to Hiroshima, she witnessed the bombing and the mushroom cloud. The next day actually made her way into what remained of central Hiroshima and spent the next 4 or 5 days wandering amongst the ruins, trying to help people, horribly burned and scarred and wounded people, trying to help them, trying to nurse them. And it utterly changed her life. It turned her into a lifetime pacifist. She spent the rest of her life actually traveling around. She regained her American citizenship and then spent the rest of her life traveling around the world preaching pacifism. Really, really interesting woman, also a person somewhat like Gordon, of very strongly held principles.
Yeah, and you also talked about, the women in, and I should mention, both of us use the term concentration camp. And so some of the viewers might, I just want to, do kind of just a quick, note on terminology. I mean, the term concentration camp, especially with the, what I call American concentration camps. I mean, that was actually a term used during that time. I mean, you had people like President Roosevelt, you had politicians, the media, and it was only until, it was after, Americans start finding out about the concentration camps in Europe that, they start making that distinction and stop using that term concentration camp in relationship to it. Today, generally historians who are in this topic use the term concentration camp to describe the camps that held Japanese Americans. And I just wanted to, but we're not trying to equate in any way the two. And I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are not talking about Auschwitz and Dachau and places like that. Obviously, nothing like that. But it's also important to point out that term, there was a great deal of very euphemistic language that the government used to talk about the incarceration of Japanese American citizens during the war. They used terms like relocation and evacuation and assembly center. They used terms that sounded downright positive in many cases to describe what was really the forced relocation, forced removal of people from their homes and concentrating them in large numbers behind barbed wire. So it's part of a much larger fabric of language that I tried to avoid using in writing this book. If you're going to tell an honest story, you need to use honest language. And so, yeah.
And a term that probably is the most confusing in terms of this topic is the term internment camp.
Yeah.
And that, that process was really, the internment process was really used for generally Japanese, German, and Italian nationals who were picked up by the FBI and held in these DOJ camps early on in the internment process. Actually, Katsugo Miho's dad was one of them. And that is distinct from what we're calling these kind of WRA concentration camps, which I think is a good way for us to go to the next person. A character that we both, are fond of because, he's such a, we both call him a rascal. We talk about his stories and the person we're talking about is Rudy Tokiwa, who actually ended up in one of the WRA concentration camps. So tell me about Rudy and what his role is.
Yeah, so Rudy was kind of a rascal. He wasn't big on following rules necessarily once he got in the Army, but huge heart. Rudy grew up on a farm in Salinas, California. And shortly after Pearl Harbor, he and his family were forced from their home and taken to the Salinas Rodeo grounds, one of these temporary assembly centers. And then later they were shipped to one of the largest of these concentration camps, Poston in Arizona. Poston was, as you can imagine, particularly during the summer, an extraordinarily hot, dusty, bleak place to be confined. But while he was at Poston, as I say, the Roosevelt administration decided to create this all Japanese American fighting force, the 442nd. As soon as they did that, a great deal of debate broke out within the camps, including Poston, among the young men in the camps about what they should do. Some of the young men argued that the last thing in the world they wanted to do was to fight for the government that had put them and their mom and their grandma behind barbed wire. Other young men argued that, well, if we enlist in the Army, if we fight and bleed and some of us die, perhaps after the war, Japanese Americans will be treated better by their fellow citizens and by the government. And Rudy was one of these young men that stood up and argued for that. He argued that they should enlist in the Army and try to change the equation in that way. So he enlisted in the 442nd, wound up in K Company, and then saw a great deal of action in Italy and little later in the war, in the fall of 1944 on the French-German border.
Yeah, no, I love Rudy's voice throughout the book. We're not talking much about Camp Shelby, but where they trained and kind of his perceptions of the South and the segregation down there, and how he responded. So he was such a strong, interesting character. But as you say, let's move to Europe and the fighting, which it was a large part of the book. And in particular, once you talk about some of the fighting that the 442 did in Europe.
Yeah, so they first landed in Anzio in Italy, and they fought their way up through Tuscany, absolutely beautiful countryside. But they had to take one after another of these hilltop towns that Tuscany is famous for. The Germans always had the high ground, so every time they needed to take a town, they had to fight their way up the side of another hill or another mountain. So it was slow going. It took a great many casualties along the way, but they eventually fought their way as far north as the Arno River. And then they were sent. By that time, they had acquired quite a reputation as a fighting force. The Germans, in fact, started calling them the Little Iron Men, and were quite fearful of them. So the army shipped them at that point north to the French-German border, to the Vosges forest, a very mountainous, sort of dark, impenetrable area. It's, I believe, the Vosges on one side of the border and the Black Forest on the German side of the border. And that's where they saw their largest and most significant battle, really. They were given the task of liberating a little town called Bruyères, where several highways and a railroad line converged. By now, it was November of 1944. It was cold and rainy and sleety and muddy. So they fought for days, took, again, very heavy casualties, finally liberated this French town, Bruyères. They fought their way on and liberated Bifontaine, another town, and Belmont, yet another town, again, fighting their way into the Vosges forest. And then finally, after days of this combat, they were told that they could get a couple nights sleep. So they went off and they crawled into barns and haylofts and cellars or wherever they could find a dry place to sleep. But early on the second night, they were awakened in the middle of the night and told to put their combat gear back on. And they weren't sure why, but they set off in the pouring down rain and mud and started up this mountain. And what had happened is, in the interval, the commanding general of the entire division had sent a unit of what was called his Texas division, a couple hundred of young men mostly from Texas and Oklahoma. General Dahlquist had sent them too deep into the Vosges forest, and they had deeper than he should have sent them, into unreconnoitered country. They had become surrounded and trapped on the end of a ridge line. Many of them were wounded and some of them were dying. They ran out of medical supplies. They ran out of food. They had no drinkable water. And so for several days, Dahlquist sent other Texas units up that mountain to try to break through and get them out, and nobody could. So finally, as I say, he awakened the Nice soldiers, the 442nd, in the middle of the night and sent them up that mountain. And Rudy was one of the young men in K Company, which was the lead company going up that mountain. They took absolutely hellacious casualties, fighting their way uphill against oftentimes literally tanks firing downhill directly at them. But they did finally, after several days of intense fighting, break through and get to the Texans and send them back down off the mountain. They were actually not then allowed to come off the mountain themselves. They were told to fight on for several more days deeper into the Vosges forest. So it was only after they had taken extraordinary casualties that they were finally brought down back off that mountain in early November of 1944.
Yeah, and so when they came off the mountain, finally, The general you mentioned, General Dahlquist, called for what was called a retreat parade. He wanted the 442nd to essentially parade in front of him, march in front of him, so he could on a platform kind of salute them. And so to set this this next clip, we have Rudy talking about it. At full strength, the 442nd is over 4,000 men. But after all the fighting they had been doing, as they went through Italy and then in France, and then especially this last month, they were down in Rudy's kind of terms, under a battalion, under 1,000 men. So just imagine, this unit of over 4,000, and it's now under 1,000. And the general is up there on the platform. He's expecting probably 2,000 to 3,000 men to march in front of him. And he sees, just under 1,000. And so he actually gets upset. And so here Rudy talks about, that exchange of the general with the commanding officer, the colonel in the unit.
The 36th Division commander wanted the 442nd to pass in review. And he said, all personnel of the 442nd will pass in review. So the 442nd passes in review, and like I say, you got 3 battalions plus headquarters, and they don't even have a battalion out there passing in review. So General Dahlquist turned around and he said to the colonel, when I order everyone to pass in review, I mean the cooks and everybody will pass in review. And Chaplain Yamada said, this is the first time I saw the colonel cry. And he said, this is all I have left.
Yeah, whenever I see that clip, it just it chokes me up, because I remember doing that interview with Rudy, and he continues. He tears up quite a bit, talking about in some ways how difficult to lose his friends and so many men, to feel disrespected by the general. This idea that they're fighting and getting killed while their families are back in American concentration camps, and how difficult that was. So it was a very emotional clip for me.
Yeah, it was also one of the first clips I saw, and I remember my wife Sharon and I watched it together, and both of us were tearing up as we watched the full clip. And it was actually one of those moments at which I really wanted to write this book, because as I say, Rudy had so much heart, and it really came through when he told those stories. So amazing guy.
Yeah. Well, the fourth person we're going to talk about, Fred Shiosaki. And what you did, I mean, you had a limited number of characters to work with. And I think you did a masterful job of selecting men that kind of represented different perspectives. So you had, Gordon, who was the, kind of the one who stood up to the government and resisted. You had the Japanese American experience from Hawaii through Katsugo Miho. You had Rudy, kind of volunteering from an American concentration camp. The next one that we have, Fred Shiosaki. So we're coming back to the state of Washington. Hang on 1 second. Grew up outside what was called the exclusion zone, that zone on, closer to the West Coast, where all Japanese Americans were removed and placed in the camps. He lived in Spokane, which was outside the exclusion zone, which was a different experience. So talk about Fred Shiosaki. Yeah,
so Fred's army name was Rosie, because his cheeks tended to pink up when he got excited. Fred's family ran a laundry in Hilliard, which is a neighborhood in Spokane down by the railroad tracks. And so Fred was one of these young men that when the 442nd was created, he went straight down to the enlistment office in Spokane, walked in, and tried to sign up for the army. And he was told that he couldn't sign up, that he was, quote, an enemy alien, which absolutely floored him. So he wound up spending the next year going to Gonzaga University, and was one of very few male students on the campus because everybody else had signed up and gone off to war. And he found that absolutely humiliating. But a year later, when the 442nd was created, Fred signed up. He wound up in K Company, same company as Rudy. So he also was one of those who went up the mountain to try to get the Texans off the mountain. And Fred was such an interesting guy. He passed away last year. He was, on the streets of Spokane. He was really basically a very sweet, gentle, soft-spoken guy. But when you got his dander up, he knew how to fight. He had learned how to fight on the streets of Spokane, where a lot of racial epithets got thrown at him, I think. So just a really interesting, blend of sort of personal attributes. But when he went up the mountain that day, he lost some really close friends who died as they were going up the mountain, and it really affected him. So by the time he was finally released from the army after the Allied victory in Europe and returned home to Spokane, he had a hard time sort of fitting back in.
Yeah, and so this this clip really shows this. This is Fred's talking about after the war. He's back in the States, trying to get back to Spokane, and he's in Washington, D.C. at the train station. And he has, this happenstance meeting with one of the men that he helped save. And so here we have Fred talking about this.
I was on the train by myself, and we stopped in Washington, D.C. And I was actually, from that railroad station, you could see the Capitol building. I'm sure that must have been the Union Station. And I was sitting there looking out the window, and this GI. GI came out of books. I think he's a buck sergeant. And he stopped and he looked at me and he looked at my patch. He says, "Hey, you were the 442nd. Yeah. He says, "Were you at the Lost Battalion?" And I said, "Yeah, I was there." He says, "I was in there."
So he was one of the 200 men that you rescued.
Yeah. Anyway, it's one of those things. I could just feel myself getting I was angry, God, and I turned to him and I said, "Do you know how many men we lost getting you guys out of there? You know how many of my friends died in there?" And well, he said, if you guys were in there, we'd have come after you." And I shook my head and I said, "Well," he said, "anyway, I want to thank you." He put out his hand and I turned away and looked out the window.
Yeah, I remember that interview with Fred because it surprised me, and I had to. If you keep watching the interview, I kept asking, So Fred, why didn't you shake that person's hand? And he said he was actually ashamed because his nature would have led me to believe that he would have and been gracious about, but he just said no, he couldn't. He was just so angry, and all he could think of was his friends. And I think at that point when the other soldiers said, "Well, we would have come after you," it just rubbed him the wrong way, and he just kind of responded the way he did.
I think he wasn't entirely sure that, in fact, they would have come for him and his guys. In fact, yeah, I mean, as I say, Fred came home angry and pretty scarred. When he moved back, his family lived in an apartment over the laundry in Spokane, and so he moved back in with his parents for a while. And I know that for a long time, his mother had to wake him up almost every night because he was screaming in his sleep. So like a lot of people from that war, Japanese American or not, there was a lot of PTSD that came home with those guys.
Yeah. And so I want to remind the viewers right now is, we'll have some time for Q&A. And So, Dan, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about it was during that time, though. I mentioned earlier how we met 7 years ago, and then you started pretty much right away. But the last 7 years has been a very turbulent time in our country. And I remember right about the time we first met was the beginning of the presidential elections for 2016. And at that point, the candidate Trump was using some pretty negative rhetoric towards immigrants, Mexicans, claiming they were murderers and rapists, and we had to stop this. And I remember us talking about kind of how, and I'll show this little kind of clip, how, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And how, as you were writing the book, all these things would come up. And I actually want to show kind of something that I wanted to show today. And one of the things that we talked about was the negative rhetoric, not only during, when Trump was first running, but the negative rhetoric that Japanese and Chinese faced in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. What I'm showing on the screen is a part of an article from the San Francisco Chronicle in 1905. And, I want to show this because I was so impacted by, what happened in Buffalo, New York, this past weekend. And some of the writings in terms of the shooter talking about replacement theory. And, I just wanted to share that, from this clip from 1905, so over like 115, 117 years ago, the rhetoric is very similar. I mean, they talked about Japanese immigrants invading the West Coast, that they were going to foist in Asiatic civilization, and that there was this plot, by the Japanese government to essentially make the West Coast and the rest of the United States part of Japan. So it's, kind of circa 1905, kind of replacement theory. And so I know we talked a lot about this, and I want to ask you, as you were writing the book, what were you thinking in terms of how this history so much rhymed with what's going on today?
Yeah, it was really startling. One of the things I did is I spent a lot of time researching and telling the immigration stories of these four guys' families. And so I was by day reading about these hardworking Japanese families immigrating to Hawaii or to the West Coast of the United States, and then coming home at night and turning on the news and hearing all this anti-immigrant rhetoric. And I was researching and writing about the incarceration of all Japanese Americans on the West Coast in these camps. At the same time, I was coming home and reading about mass incarcerations in this country, including on our southern border. So, there was this, it was alarming how to the extent to which what I was reading as history was being mirrored in everyday events or in events on the news. And particularly in terms of the language, I just want to say something about that. I, as part of my background research, because I wanted to write about the immigrant experience, I went back to the early Asian immigration to the United States, which was primarily Chinese workers coming to California during and immediately after the gold rush to work mostly to supply the miners with laundry services and things like that. Right from the beginning, the anti-Asian, anti-Chinese originally rhetoric was so virulent, and the violence was so directed against them was so palpable that it's really shocking when you go back and you read it. But the thing that really sticks with me is there were certain images and tropes and memes that were promulgated by, particularly when you get into that era known as the Yellow Peril, when the Hearst newspapers and other newspapers were attacking Asian immigrants. There were certain memes and images of, invading locusts and snakes and vermin and rats and bringers of disease. And then you start seeing those same memes and tropes and images pop up again at the time of Pearl Harbor. And then you see them again popping up very recently, directed at Asian Americans in general. It's the same stuff, same kind of vitriol that gets recycled, every generation or every few generations. It's not new. It just keeps getting pulled up again. So it was very, very palpable and upsetting to see.
Well, and that's why I just want to thank you so much for writing this book, because I think it's so important for people to understand these things that have happened in the past. And I think your storytelling, allows people to really kind of unpack this history in a very enjoyable way. I mean, your storytelling is so powerful. And my hope is, as people read your book and learn more about the history, it will make them more aware and perhaps more active. I'm going to show one more, kind of clip, because this is a photograph of me on the steps of the federal courthouse in Seattle, which is named the William Kenzo Nakamura. Actually, he was a Medal of Honor recipient who fought in the 442nd. But I'm there the day after the Trump versus Hawaii opinion was released by the Supreme Court. And the similarities between the Supreme Court ruling Korematsu versus the US and this one were stark in that essentially military necessity or national security was used as a rationale to discriminate against a group of people. And stop sharing. And it just showed me in terms of how much words matter, because I think those impacted in terms of the Supreme Court ruling during 1944 when they ruled in terms of although when the Supreme Court came out with their opinion, right away it was repudiated by so many legal scholars that this is a very racist type of thing. But it just shows you how there is no kind of constitution that gives this set sort of rules. It's very kind of open to interpretation, and we know that that's part of our system, and how important it is for people to be aware of these things and to speak out. With that, Dan, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to give you the last word right now, but reminding the folks that we have some time for Q&A after. So Dan, why don't you finish up with what you'd like to say, and then we'll go to Q&A.
I think I want to thank you again, Tom, for not only the work you've done at Densho, but all the doors you've opened for me within the Japanese American community. One of the things I really wanted to do in this book is to get a hold of the family members of the people I'm writing about and really get to know them and make sure it was okay with them that I write about their loved ones, and to meet other people in the community and some sort of explain what I was trying to do. So I very much appreciate all you've done to facilitate this book.
No, it's been my pleasure. I mean, in many ways, I've been doing this for 26 years. To have the stories we collected, 20, 25 years ago, to come back and come back to life in your book and other products has just really been tremendous for me. So let's go to the questions. The first one is, a question was, how many years did you spend doing research for this book? Can you share more about your thought process and how you decided on the 4 main men to feature?
Sure. I'm not sure the exact number of years, but it must be at least 4 years, I think, 4 or 5 years of research and writing. And for the first few years, it's almost entirely research. I don't really like to start writing until I have a pretty good sense of the overall structure of the story, the sort of the main plot points along the way, the pieces of history I want to illuminate. It's only when I feel pretty comfortable with those that I start writing. And even as I write, I'm continuously going back and doing more research to fill in gaps. I do a lot of what I call sort of micro research, which is that if I'm writing about some battle in some village in Italy in 1944 at night, maybe I need to know when the moon came up that night. Well, you can find that stuff on the internet these days. So even as I'm writing, I'm continually, out there digging up little factoids and things that will help enrich the narrative and bring it to life. So, that's my process is pretty messy, frankly. I don't really like to advocate anybody following my process because it's very scattered. It seems to work for me, but it's not very efficient. It takes a long time. But the one thing that I will say about that is that one thing I do is I try to write in chunks that I think of as scenes. And so in most cases, a scene might be anywhere from a short paragraph to 5 pages. But whenever possible, I literally think of myself as being behind a camera and trying to see the scene right as if I'm watching the scene unfold in front of me. And so dividing the book into chapters and things like that usually comes later. I'm not really thinking primarily in terms of chapters. I'm thinking in terms of a series of scenes that taken together will unfold the larger story.
We have another, another question about kind of the research writing process. And the question is, were you able to access significant primary sources from the families of the people you're writing about? Things like letters, photos, etc.
Yes, I was, and that was extremely helpful. To some extent, that came directly from families, particularly the Miho family in Hawaii. Katz's daughter, Mariko, had saved an enormous amount of stuff in her mom's back bedroom, primary sources. But in many other cases, I was able to find those materials either in digital form at Densho. One of the things Densho does is it digitizes camp newsletters and correspondence and all kinds of material beyond the actual videotaped interviews, and other archives as well. The University of Hawaii has a tremendous collection on the 442nd, and I spent days you don't really want to do this when you're in Hawaii, but I spent days in a dark little archive room with my wife, who was enormously helpful to me on this project, Sharon, going through the letters of the chaplains in the 442nd who are woven into the story. And then other places too, the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, I found some wonderful letters there. So combination of things that families brought to me and things that are in digital form at Densho or in physical archives, various places.
Great. And I think we'll have time for one more question, the last question in the Q&A. And it has, the question is asking about kind of the thinking or formation of Asian American identity and how, the stories that you told about those 4 men, as well as, your knowledge of history and immigration, how does that affect the formation of Asian American identity? That's kind of a deep question.
I think you're probably much better situated to answer that than I am. But I mean, I have certainly, as an outsider, as a non-Asian, I've been privileged to get a lot of glimpses into sort of the evolution of Asian American identity, as I say, starting with this living through these extraordinarily dangerous times in the 19th and early 20th century, when there was literally a great deal of outright violence directed at Asian immigrants, through these cycles of hatred that have come up over and over again. I've just been privileged to sort of watch the evolution of an independent Asian American as opposed to Asian identity take shape. And one of the things that's really been amazing and impressive to me, Tom, is how coherent and mutually supportive the Japanese American community in this country is. I've met so many wonderful people and made a lot of really wonderful friends, and I really admire the way that Japanese Americans sort of nurture their history and keep the story alive and take care of one another, and you know, go out of their way to make sure the rest of us understand their contribution to what this country has done, because it hasn't always been that way. The Nisei generation, for instance, and Tom knows as well, they tended not to talk about the camp life. The 442 vets tended not to talk about their war experience. So it's really been subsequent generations, in my experience, that have been willing to sort of start bringing some of these stories forward. And I know, Tom, you know this much better than I do.
No, thank you. I mean, I'll just make a quick note that, I think what you did with the book in some ways does sort of help bring out this Asian American identity, in that, I'm a big believer of story, and there is no one identity, or it's hard to characterize something like Asian American as certain characteristics. And I think what you do, and what I've noticed in the stories, is that it is such a diverse thing. It's even this concept of Asian American, in terms of I'm Japanese American, but there's Chinese American, South Asians, in terms of Indian. I mean, they're all classified as Asian American. There is no one characteristic, but it does come down very much to the stories. And what I love so much about what we do in terms of sharing these stories is it helps bring that out, the different flavors, the nuances. I think you talk about in terms of, in some ways, I would say the magic of the 442 was this blend of Japanese culture with American values that was very, very powerful, that in some ways helped me think about the power of immigrants to this country, and how important it is for our country, and how much we want to foster and honor that. So there's so many different nuances and things that your book brought out. Well, more questions showed up, but we're kind of running here. So Nick showed up. So Nick, why don't you go ahead and end the presentation?
All right. Well, thank you guys so much both for joining us and for that great conversation and the PowerPoint and all that. And yeah, it was fantastic. So this is the book. I'm encouraged to go get this book and get everything else that's inside there, that's enclosed in that side of there. So check that out. I put links in there. Check it out on powells.com, and check out the many other events that we have coming up once you're there. And thanks for joining us once again. Thank you both so much.